Islam is built on two covenants, and these are spiritual covenants. One is the shahada, under which Muslims are bound, the binding of a soul to the example and teaching of Muhammad. And the second covenant is what I'm going to be discussing in this session. This is the covenant of the dhimma. It's the covenant for non-Muslims living under Islam. And if you could imagine two castles or two strongholds, spiritual strongholds, one containing Muslims and the other containing non-Muslims, and both controlled by Islam, that's the structure of Islam. It's provided a covenant for Muslims, but also a covenant of surrender for non-Muslims as well. And one of the challenges when you get involved in ministry to Muslims is that Christians can find themselves getting trapped in the stronghold for non-Muslims that's been set aside by Islam. So that there's not just the trap, as it were, of Islam, the spiritual powers and forces that have been set up to hold Muslims in captivity, but there's also, Islam has a strategy for binding and restricting non-Muslims as well. And it's very important when you're involved in mission outreach to Muslims that you understand the structure, the spiritual structure of those two covenants. When you're calling someone out of Islam into the Christian faith, you're calling them to be set free, to be saved, to be rescued. And it's important that you rescue them out of one fortress, not to put them in the other, but they'll be completely free as well. And also the Christian church that has laboured long under Islam and suffered greatly, it needs to be set free as well from its own bonds, the bonds of the dhimma, which have contained it and constrained it. And I've seen many miracles of Christians who've been set free from fear and the bonds of the whole world of the dhimma thinking, and have only then been able to be effective in evangelism to Muslims. So that's why it's important to go deeply into this second covenant, the covenant of the dhimma, to explain how it works and why it needs to be resisted. In a later session, I will be providing prayers and a ministry strategy for coming against these two covenants and setting people free from them. So we will have the opportunity to go through that. But here we're going to begin with explaining the Dimmer Pact. And this is the first part of the session on understanding Islam, in unpacking the Dhimma. There are two kinds of surrender that Islam offers to the world. The first kind is the submission of the convert. So you say, I surrender, literally. I become a Muslim. But the second kind of submission or surrender is the surrender of conquest, where a non-Muslim community agrees to live under Islamic rule and accepts its authority. It's a political surrender. But it also has very significant spiritual dimensions to it as well, as you will see. Just a reminder about Islam's theological claims. It claims that it is the original religion, the first religion, and that Christians and Jews, being people of the book, are in a sense lost Muslims whose scriptures are now corrupted and not what they used to be. And Muhammad, the ultimate guide and final prophet, has come to call Christians and Jews back to their original religion, which is Islam. And so Islam teaches that true Christians and Jews will accept Islam and will follow Muhammad. As Tantawi, who was previously a spiritual leader at Al-Azhar University, said, there are two kinds of Jews. The good ones become Muslims. And that's the perspective of Islam towards Christians, that they, if they're really sincere and love God, they will follow Islam because it's the completion of their religion. Just a reminder also that the Quran says that Muslims are the best people with a destiny to guide mankind. And that is the destiny of Islam to dominate or rule or triumph over all other religions. And that is not only a spiritual triumph, but a political triumph. It's a military triumph. And we're going to look into the implications of that political or military triumph here. In 2006, Pope Benedict gave a speech in Regensburg, and he quoted Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos, a Byzantine emperor, who referred to Muhammad's command to spread by the sword the faith he preached. And all hell broke loose across the Muslim world after he gave that speech. It was a fairly academic speech, a lecture, and it would have been hard to predict the reaction, but I believe a nun was killed somewhere in Africa, and there were various riots, and a number of people were killed in those riots. And Muslim leaders protested the implication that Islam had been spread by violence. And one of the most interesting responses was the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, Sheikh Abdulaziz al-Sheikh. He said, in response to the Pope, Muhammad gave 3 options: either accept Islam or surrender and pay tax. The third is actually the sword. And they will be allowed to remain in their land, observing their religion under the protection of Muslims. Those who read the Quran and the Sunnah can understand the facts. Now what he's saying is, it's not fair to say that Islam was spread by force, because people always had the option of surrendering and living under Islamic rule. So they weren't compelled to become Muslims. They had the choice of just surrendering to Islam. So you're maligning our religion when you say that Islam was spread by military force. A very interesting response, isn't it? Very, very interesting response. In a way, he confirms by his response the very truth of the thing that he's seeking to deny. So this is the classical view that Islam, when it spreads, should offer 3 choices. Now, the process of evangelization from an Islamic point of view, of da'wah, uses jihad as the method of proclaiming Islam. An official ruling from a previous Chief Justice in Saudi Arabia said at first the fighting, remember you could also translate that the killing, was forbidden, then it was permitted, and after that it was made obligatory. He's speaking about different stages in Muhammad's life. Firstly against those who start the fighting against you, the defensive jihad, and then against all those who worship others along with Allah. So he's saying the final word that was that Muslims had a responsibility to wage war against all those who do not follow Islam. Worship others alongside Allah, that's an Islamic way of saying non-Muslims, people that reject the pure monotheism of Islam. That is the sheikh, he was the sheikh of the sacred mosque of Mecca and former Chief Justice of Saudi Arabia. Now the question that then arises is, what happens to non-Muslims in an Islamic state? What determines their status and their position? What is the horizon of their existence? What does it mean to be a Christian living in Sharia conditions? And why is it so? How did it come to be that Sharia law has this system? I'd like to start by speaking about a township called Khaybar. It was an oasis. It is an oasis in Arabia. When Hezbollah was sending rockets over to Israel some years ago, some of them were called Khaybar rockets. That was their name. You know, like, remember Khaybar. We're going to put the name on the rockets. Rosie, the Balinese bomber who killed many people in Bali some years back, when he was convicted in the courtroom in Indonesia, he shouted out to the court, "Remember Khaybar, the armies of Muhammad are coming back to defeat you," he said. And in fact, the fate of Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Sabaeans, Hindus, millions of people were determined by the precedent in Islamic law of Muhammad's treatment of the Jews when he conquered them in Khaybar. It's a very important incident in the history of Islam that establishes the foundation in Islamic law for the position of non-Muslims in an Islamic world. In Medina, he found the Jews very difficult. They argued with him. He thought they would accept his claims that he was their Messiah, the one who was to come, but they didn't. And his biography says that he called them the men who argued too much. And he had long, difficult conversations with rabbis in Medina. In the end, he began expelling the tribes one by one. And he spoke to them and said, "Aslim taslam, accept Islam and you will be safe." The implication being if they didn't, they wouldn't. And the final tribe that was left in Medina, the Qurayza tribe, he wiped them out. About 600 to 900 men were beheaded in the marketplace of Medina. The women and children were enslaved. Muhammad picked up a concubine, a wife from those women. And then later he turned his attention to Khaybar, to which some of the Jews had fled. It was a fertile oasis inhabited mainly by Jews. And they were quite skilled at managing the trees that were there, the fruit trees. Khaybar was attacked and told to embrace Islam, accept Islam, and then the war stops. And many Jews were enslaved and killed as part of the hostilities, but finally the remaining Jews surrendered and they were allowed to have a treaty, a dhimma of surrender, a pact of surrender, and they were allowed to keep Judaism as their religion. So this is the first time in Islam that a community is permitted to live under Islamic rule and given official permission to have a different faith. They kept their Judaism. And the pact that they came under is called the Dimmer Pact. And one of the conditions of the pact that applied in Khaybar is that they had to pay a large proportion of their harvests to the Muslim community. So there was a tribute that they had to keep paying in perpetuity. And this establishes in Islamic law the precedent for how Muslims should treat non-Muslims. There is an attack, a possibility of surrender if you want to keep your life and your religion, and if you accept a covenant of surrender, you're allowed to keep your faith and live under Islamic rule. That's the end of the first section.